Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On April the 20th, 2019, 20 years will have come to pass since one of the deadliest and most tragic and one of the most discussed school massacres, at least in the Western world. You guessed it. The massacre took place at the Columbine High School near Littleton in Colorado, so in the greater Denver area of that state. The victims included 12 students, one teacher who was teaching computer science, if I remember correctly, and then was also a sports coach. Then a total of 24 people were injured, 21 by firearms, and then the two perpetrators, 18-year-old Eric Harris and 17-year-old Dylan Klebold, killed themselves. Concerning the Columbine High School massacre, there have been a number of stories that have later been disputed or refuted. For example, the claim that was often repeated, especially in the first days, weeks, and months after the massacre, that two of the three or possibly four born-again Christian victims were asked by their killers, their executioners, if you want to put it that way, if they believed in God. And again, you guessed it, Cassie Bernal and then Rachel Scott. It is strange that although there was at least one other born-again Christian among the 13 victims, John Tomlin, who indeed had even driven to Mexico to help build a house for a poor family, and who placed his Bible on the windshield of his car, or inside the windshield of his car, in the hope that some students and or teachers passing by would read it. He is rarely mentioned in the media, in the mass media. The only African-American victim of the massacre, Isaiah Scholes, possibly was also a born-again Christian. At least he was attending some local congregation's youth group. So strong was the belief of Cassie Bernal's parents that indeed her killer, whether Eric Harris or actually Eric Harris was proven to be her killer, had actually asked her if she believed in God, and after she had paused and replied yes, he had killed her. That she wrote her daughter's brief biography entitled "She Said Yes: The Unlikely Martyrdom of Cassie Bernal." She did mention that another girl was asked, actually in the same library where most of the shootings, deadly shootings, took place, if that other girl believed in God, and she had said yes. She had been then shot, but had miraculously survived. That girl's, or now woman's, name is Valine Schnur. She hasn't wanted to be regarded as any kind of a Christian hero, although of course she's thankful to God that she survived the massacre. Because there are conflicting testimonies of exactly who among the victims were asked if they believed in God. One of the survivors, possibly Craig Scott, the brother or a brother of Rachel Scott, one of the most publicized victims of the massacre, alongside Cassie Bernal, and then David Sanders, the sole teacher to be killed in the massacre, claimed to have heard Cassie's voice. And Cassie's killer had asked her if she believed in God, and then she said yes, and then the witness who actually didn't see Cassie but heard her said that he heard that gunshot, fatal gunshot. Then other eyewitnesses or survivors have come forward saying that actually Valine Schnurr was the girl who was asked if she believed in God. Rachel Scott's father was so strong in his belief that he even said in an informal sermon or testimony, call it what you want, some or several months after her daughter's murder, that either Dylan Klebold or Eric Harris had asked Rachel if she believed in God, and then she had said yes, and then the boy had fatally shot her. In fact, the shooting did not involve, Rachel's shooting at least did not involve the exchange of words. Whoever it was who killed Rachel, either Dylan Klebold or Eric Harris, actually shot her from further away. So definitely from further away than point blank range, or probably anyway without talking to her. And then the boy who was with Rachel Scott and survived later told that as far as he could recollect, words would have been exchanged. Then Daniel Rohrbough, who also was a victim, Rohrbough or Rohrbough, was supposedly holding open the cafeteria door, or one of the doors of the cafeteria, to help fellow students escape, but in fact he was smoking, and in the act of smoking or close to or after it, he was killed. But anyway, many people, especially teenagers and young adults, have in the 2 decades that have passed since the Columbine High School massacre reportedly dedicated or rededicated their lives to Jesus Christ. One of the survivors that day, Crystal Woodman Miller, is now a dedicated Christian writer and motivational speaker. And she decided that day to commit her life to Jesus Christ. There have been, of course, copycat school shootings, and they have seemed to happen in North America, especially the United States, every year, although by no means all of them attract a lot of publicity. In 2018, there was another major school shooting in Parkland, Florida. Ironically, on Valentine's Day, February the 14th, 2018. And 19-year-old former student Nicholas Cruz, or Cruz, was the assailant. He was arrested. He was charged with 17 counts of premeditated murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. And always when these kinds of mass shootings happen, the gun control debate heats up. Those who oppose gun control claim that if only enough people, teachers, students, and law enforcement officers and guards were armed, a lot fewer deadly shootings would take place. Then the proponents of gun control claim that exactly the wide availability of guns and then this culture of death are to blame. And neither side is totally correct, because of course what we are dealing with is the ongoing battle between good and evil, between God and Satan. And unfortunately, since most people are not following God according to the Bible, such tragic events take place. Of course, we should not take them lightly. We should not consider them as collateral damage, as the authoritarian Philippine president Rodrigo Duterte has said about the killing of children and young teenagers in his war against drugs. But every single school shooting is, of course, a tragedy. One of the spiritual legacies of the school shooting has been Rachel's Challenge program that has been accepted by students in probably hundreds of schools across the United States and possibly even in some other countries like Canada. And basically, that program challenges those students to show kindness and caring towards, for example, those students who seem to be excluded or seem to be excluding themselves, and showing Rachel Scott as an example, because Rachel Scott, shortly before her murder, started to talk, I think, in the Columbine High School's cafeteria to a boy who seemed sad and withdrawn, and found out that his parents had recently been killed in a car crash. So going out of one's way, leaving one's comfort zone to connect lovingly and caringly and kindly with those students who seem to have emotional and or other issues. And of course, especially if the acceptors of and practitioners of Rachel's Challenge happen to be born-again Christians, then that makes the program's application, especially in a spiritual sense, much easier. They can invite such students to home-based Bible studies, informal youth, Christian youth gatherings, eventually church services, Christian retreats, and so forth. Indeed, Cassie Bernal was saved in early March 1997 in a Christian weekend youth retreat, where her good Christian friend Jamie, whom she had befriended at the Christian Fellowship School in or near Littleton, starting in January 1997, had invited her and had actually written a letter to Cassie's parents begging her parents to let Cassie go there. And during that weekend, whose themes were overcoming the temptations of evil and breaking out of the selfish life, Cassie then decided to end her opposition to God and to surrender her life to Jesus Christ. Cassie had been sliding away emotionally and spiritually from her parents starting sometime between 1992 and 1994. Here I'm quoting her mother, Misty Bernal, in Cassie's brief biography. She said yes. She had also, which had concerned her parents possibly even more, started to slide away from those normally behaving girls whose friends or friend she had been until then. And she had started to attach herself to a girl who was even more profoundly troubled spiritually and emotionally. Mrs. Bernal wisely decided not to reveal the true identity of this girl, even by mentioning her real first name. She simply called the girl Mona. And then their high school, which she decided not to name, calling it only Beaver High School, had other emotionally and spiritually troubled students, such as Rick. Cassie had stayed at the school after her regular lessons had ended, allegedly to improve her grade in visual arts. She was, on one occasion, working on her art project, and that was on one evening. But then in the same classroom were sitting Mona and Rick. And Rick seemed to be out of control. Neither his parents nor the school's assistant principal could control him. And after Cassie then became a Christian and decided to leave her friends who were dabbling in occultism and Satanism, once one of them yelled, I think, a can of Coca-Cola at their house and yelled murderer while he was being driven by another teenager past their house. The Bernals decided to treat this as an isolated incident. They moved to another suburb or neighborhood, to a much or clearly smaller house. And Cassie had already, before her conversion, started to attend a local non-denominational or interdenominational congregation known as the West Bowles Community Church, more specifically its youth meetings. And after becoming a Christian, she became a clearly more active and open member of that youth group. And she looked forward to those youth meetings and Bible studies. Indeed, on the evening of that day, fateful day when she was murdered, on April the 20th, 1999, she was to attend a Bible study. And she, of course, struggled in those 2 years leading up to her murder here on the earth when she was a Christian. At times she felt so far from God. At times she felt like a hypocrite for not sharing her faith more openly with her fellow students. There were some conflicting stories about how much exactly she witnessed about her faith at Columbine High School. 2 girls interviewed apparently by Misty Bernal for Cassie's biography said that she was different in a positive way. She was kind to everyone and never judged anyone by how they dressed or looked. And then another one said that another girl said in her interview that she only found out about Cassie's religious beliefs after she was killed. One question, of course, remains whether Cassie Bernal and Rachel Scott ever personally knew each other this side of heaven. Because Cassie Bernal wrote in her journal a poem that I will quote briefly in this video. Am I the only one who seeks your glory? And so forth. And in the same poem, she later wrote something like this: all I want is that you will walk with me through these halls of tragedy, and so forth. So let's look at, and of course, a number of documentaries have been produced about the Columbine High School massacre. 3 of the 4 parents of those 2 boys who committed the murders and then shot themselves fatally, committing suicide, has come forward. In 2016, if I remember correctly, Sue Klebold, the mother of Dylan Klebold, decided to come forward. So either in 2016 or 17, sorry. She wrote a book entitled The Mother's Reckoning. And obviously she continues to feel deeply saddened by the horrible crimes that her other son committed. Dylan had an older brother, by the way. And Sue Klebold had placed high hopes on Dylan because Dylan had kind of golden hair. She had called him her sunshine boy. And in childhood, Dylan seemed very eager to learn and seemed to be kind and didn't seem to have any inclination to hurt others. In his teenage years, Dylan gradually changed. He became more irritable. And for example, if he didn't do well at school, he was angry. And sometimes Sue Klebold did talk to her son about the need for good behavior and self-discipline and so forth. And then I think that on one occasion he said, "Mom, don't control me so much," or something like that. This is a quote from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's news. This was posted on April the 20th, 2018, when 19 years had come to pass since the Columbine High School massacre. I'm quickly summarizing this article. After many years of trying to hide herself from the public eye, Sue has become an advocate for mental health and suicide prevention. She shared some of her story with CBC News. What is your most vivid memory of that day? I actually have two vivid memories of that day. One is in the morning when Dylan left the house and said goodbye, or actually bye. And it was still dark. I heard him get up early and walk quickly past my door. He was a little earlier than he usually gets up, and I didn't know why. I popped my head out the door and called his name, actually nicknamed Dill, and all I heard in the darkness was the word bye. And then he slammed the door. That is a memory that is very vivid, and I will always carry that intense feeling. The other memory that I have of that day was the day itself. We were asked to leave our home, and I spent most of that day sitting on the ground outside because we had no place to sit. And I was crying a lot, and I just remember asking the police that were there over and over again, "Is my son alive? What's happened to Dylan?" And then she said on another occasion in another interview, probably more than once, that she actually prayed God to let Dylan die before Dylan would take the lives of more people. How did you find out what your son had done? Well, it really came in pieces. I was aware that there was something going on at the school, some kind of shooting, that people believed he was involved. I could not believe that my son was capable of hurting other people, and Dylan's friends had the same experience. And perhaps they were staging something as they often did for video classes, and maybe why the ammunition was replaced blanks. We really didn't know. But I kept wondering, if Dylan was alive or dead, and I remember asking a policeman for the millionth time, "Is my son dead?" And finally someone turned to me and said, "Yes, he is." What, if any, indication did you have about what your son was going to do? I can't say that I had any indication that I knew what he was going to do. Dylan behaved very much like any other teenager that I had ever known. I was a teacher for years, and more specifically, she helped disabled students. I taught in a community college. I was an educator. I had a master's degree in education. I can't say that there was ever anything that Dylan did that worried me, except in his junior year at that high school, of course. He got into some trouble for the first time in his life. He had a couple of incidents all at once. He scratched a locker at school. He and his friends hacked into the computer system at that school because he was one of the computer technicians at the school. And he and his friend Eric were arrested for stealing something. I think a stereo from the trunk of a van or truck. And then Dylan Klebold claimed that supposedly because the United States is the land of the free, they had a right to steal something that some stupid person had left in the middle of nowhere in his car. And they had to then take those anger management courses or lessons. They pretended to be sorry for stealing that equipment, and their correctional officer or officers wrote that in their opinion the two boys would have good futures ahead of them. However, Eric in his private journal mocked those police officers, and they spent months, if not the better part of a year in advance, to make sure that as many people as possible, especially as many fellow students as possible, would die. And they indeed decided to time the attack so that the Commons, the official name for the Columbine High School's cafeteria, would be packed with people, especially students, but also teachers, so as to achieve the maximum number of casualties. They produced these homemade propane bombs that fortunately, by God's grace, failed to detonate, and that probably frustrated especially Eric. It seems to me, based on the articles I've read, that Dylan was someone, and this claim was already made by some or several journalists back in the spring of 1999, so shortly after the massacre, that Dylan was someone who needed a leader of some kind. And Eric then was that leader. They loved to play the Doom computer game, which involved digitally destroying opponents, the diametric opposite of Minecraft, designed by a couple of Swedish computer programmers, where in order to win, you have to build, construct, instead of destroy. Anyway, Sue Klebold and her husband, Tom, from whom she unfortunately later got divorced, they had emotional issues, for example, because of what Dylan did. They were kind enough to write a brief postcard to the Bernals, and in it they expressed deep sorrow about what had happened at Columbine High School, and they deeply appreciated Cassie Bernal for having brought joy into the lives of many people and for having been taken in a moment of madness. They admitted that they had never seen hatred or anger in Dylan until that massacre. In other words, that they had been fooled by Dylan. And then they expressed the comforting hope that God would comfort the Bernals. Misty Bernal even quoted that postcard in her biography of Cassie. She said yes and expressed appreciation for that, and admitted that it must have taken Mr. and Mrs. Klebold a lot of courage and possibly even humility to write that postcard. But let's get back. That happened in a cluster in his junior year, and I was very, very upset. I didn't know what it meant. The boys were put in a diversion program rather than going to jail. After all, they were still both minors, and they pretended to be sorry for what they had done, and they had had no previous criminal record. They had counseling, they had classes, they had to pay money to compensate their victim. So all these things were occurring, and I remember asking the diversion counselor, this is so out of character for Dylan. What could this mean? Could this mean something? And we talked with Dylan, and she said, Dylan, do you think you need counseling? And he said, no, I don't, but I will prove to you I'm fine and I'll get my life back on track. And he did over the next 14 months. Yes, outwardly. But inwardly, he was planning this deadly massacre with Eric Harris. Even in the days preceding the shootings, he went to a prom just a few days before the shootings. He came home at 4 a.m. and we talked. He told me, "Thank you for sending me. I had the best time of my life." 3 days later, he was participating in a massacre. We were very, very confused. None of us could understand he had been there willfully. Couldn't believe it because it didn't match his life. Sorry. Dylan had applied to and been accepted at 4 colleges and even selected a dorm room. Sue said there were never any guns in the home. Why do you think he did what he did? It's very hard to answer that question because I don't think I can. I don't think anyone can. After I learned more about Dylan and his state of mind after his death, I think one of the big factors in this was the fact that he was depressed and suicidal. And we had found some writings he had done at the age of 15, where he was talking about being in agony and wanting to die, and wanting to get a gun to end his life. I think he was feeling disgraced and belittled in some of the social interactions that occurred at the school. And in this interview, she said she believed that Dylan was experiencing some bullying at school and that being arrested with his friend Eric solidified their bond. Then again, it seems that especially Eric himself bullied some students. And I think that bullying was used as some sort of a social excuse for these massacres. Of course, bullying is never a valid justification for killing other people. I know, I mean, I was bullied at school for several years, actually for most of the 1980s. First in Finland, and then after I immigrated with my family to Canada, to Thunder Bay, Ontario, if you want me to be more specific, at one of that city's high schools, which of course I will not name because I don't want to worsen its reputation. I was bullied by a few students, especially one, for the first 2 years, or for parts of the first 2 years. But then after the 1988-1989 school year, it largely ended. So I know what bullying is. And yet I don't think I ever seriously thought about killing any of those. And fortunately, 2 of the students who bullied me in Finland later did apologize to me. And of course, I did forgive them. Do you think some people blame you as Dylan's parent? Of course, yes. And one of the things that occurred right from the beginning was just this storm of blame. Our own governor went on national television and said it was the parents' fault. After the shooting in Parkland, Florida, President Trump suggested teachers should be armed. What do you think? I don't like that idea. Certainly in Colorado, we know that of deaths by firearms, about 3/4 of those deaths are suicides. What this tells me is that I want to make it as difficult as possible for someone to have a firearm. I think arming teachers raises more risks than it creates in safeguards. People who use guns, like the FBI or police officers, have tons and tons of training and impulse control. Even with those things in place, they still harm people that they shouldn't be harming. It's too great a risk to arm a teacher. In my opinion, we are making schools less safe by arming teachers. Have you been able to find some peace? I have, but it's been a very long time. What I have found to be helpful for me was my connection with other survivors of suicide loss, because in my mind, and yes, I cannot imply at all that Dylan's death was only about suicide because he murdered people. I feel that I'm the mother of someone who died by suicide. We've passed through these doorways of just feeling like a victim, where you feel helpless and beaten by life, and then you begin to feel like a survivor. And then you become an advocate, someone who wants to make a change, and it kind of crystallizes what you want to live for and fight for. And I think that's sort of what has happened to me. And on May the 1st, 2018, she spoke in Windsor, Ontario, across the St. Clair's River from Detroit, Michigan, as a featured guest at the Canadian Mental Health Association's Breakfast of Champions at the St. Clair Centre for the Arts. And that speech was videotaped and is, as far as I can remember, still available on YouTube. But getting back to now, the Columbine High School Massacre. Yeah, there were certain groups of people. One were those teenagers who professed to be Christians. Another one were ethnic minority students, although relatively few of them belonged to that group. One Hispanic American student was killed, at least according to his last name, Kyle Velasquez, who had special needs. In other words, he was a special education student, and he, along with most other victims, was killed in the school's library. And then Isaiah Scholes was the sole African American student. Well, based on their last names, there seemed to be students from different European backgrounds. Daniel Mauser could well have been of German background based on the spelling of his last name. Then Matthew Kechter, or Kechter, may well also have been of German background. Corey de Puter, maybe of French or Spanish background. Steve Kernow, maybe of some Slavic, Eastern European background. And then the so-called jocks. In other words, successful athletes who allegedly had been bullying Dylan and Eric. And Eric and Dylan were both grade 12 students. Dylan had already turned 18, so he could legally buy firearms. Eric had already turned 18. He could legally buy firearms. Dylan was still 17. His prom date, Robin Anderson, if I remember her correctly, had inadvertently bought a gun and given it to Dylan, if I remember correctly. But obviously she had no part in the massacre. She didn't believe that Dylan was going to perpetrate that massacre with Eric. The massacre took place during about 49 minutes, of course, not continuous shooting, but from the first shooting incident at 11:19 a.m. local time to the two boys' collective suicide at 12:08 p.m. They used Intratec Tech DC9 High Point 995 carbine, Savage 67H pump action shotgun, Stevens 311D double-barreled sawed-off shotgun, 99 explosives, and 4 knives. Eric Harris had created a private website on America Online already in 1996. And then it was initially to host levels, or WADs, that he created for use in the first-person shooter video games Doom and Doom 2, as well as Quake. And on the site, he began a blog or internet diary, which included jokes and his thoughts on parents, school, and friends, but also detailed his sneaking out of the house to cause mischief and vandalism, such as lighting fireworks with his friend Dylan and others. The mascot of Columbine High School is the Rebels, and he called these Rebel missions. Harris and Klebold adopted the nicknames Reb and Vodka, respectively. Beginning in early 1997, the blog postings began to show the first signs of Harris's ever-growing anger against society. He wrote, "The first true pipe bombs created entirely from scratch by the rebels. Now our only problem is to find the place that will be ground zero." Few people visited Harris's website, and only in 1998 did it cause concern. When he ended a blog post detailing murderous fantasies with "all I want to kill and injure as many of you as I can, especially a few people like Brooks Brown," who happened to be a classmate, with whom, however, he later reconciled. And he was one of the few people he saw whom he intentionally spared. Because Brooks Brown met Eric on the school's parking lot. He had gone out for his usual puff of cigarette. He himself had been absent without a reason, in other words, skipped one of his lessons. And he was concerned about the fact that Eric hadn't shown up at the school at all that morning, and he had missed a test. Eric then mockingly laughed in response, saying, "It doesn't matter anymore." Then he told Brooks, "Brooks, I like you now, get out of here, go home." And Brooks Brown left the school. I wish that he had had a mobile phone with which he could have contacted 911, saying that a massacre was about to happen, although probably even he didn't realize exactly what Eric Harris was up to. He walked out of the school grounds and I think went to a friend's home. After Brown's parents viewed the site, they contacted the Jeffco Sheriff's Office because it was in Jefferson County, Colorado. When investigator Michael Guerra accessed the website, he discovered numerous violent threats directed against the students and teachers of Columbine High School. He wrote a draft affidavit requesting a search warrant of the Harris household. The affidavit also mentioned the discovery of an exploded pipe bomb in February 1998 and a suspicion of Harris being involved in the unsolved case. The affidavit tragically was never filed. Both Harris and Klebold kept journals or diaries, which were released to the public in 2006. In the journals, the pair would eventually document their arsenal or storage of weapons and plan of attack. They also incorporated their schoolwork into their pre-massacre activities. They both displayed themes of violence in their creative writing projects. Harris wished for a lot of foreshadowing and dramatic irony to be involved in the massacre plot. He wrote a paper on school shootings and a poem from the perspective of a bullet. Klebold wrote a short story about a man killing student, which worried his teacher so much that she alerted his parents. Both had actively researched war and murder. Both idealized or at least pretended to admire Nazis, and according to a magazine article about them published shortly after the shootings, they even learned enough German to be able to tease their peers. And they chose the date, apparently, because it happened to be the 110th anniversary of the German Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler's birth. Yeah, Harris had written a paper on the Nazis, or National Socialists of Germany, and Klebold had written a paper on the American cult leader Charles Manson, who then was sentenced to life imprisonment and died of natural causes a couple of years or over 1 year ago. Yeah, in November 2017. In a psychology course, Harris wrote he dreamed of going on a shooting spree with Klebold. Echoing a science course, Harris's journals included several experimental bomb detonations. They were enrolled in video production courses. In one video called Radioactive Clothing, they were depicted with fake guns and rigging fake explosives to take out another one of those radioactive clothes infested camps. When an economics course had Harris make an ad for a business, he and Klebold made a video called Hitmen for Hire in December 1998, which was released in February 2004. It depicts them as part of the Trenchcoat Mafia, a clique in the school who wore black trench coats, extorting money for protecting preps from bullies. They were apparently not a part of the Trenchcoat Mafia, however, but were friends with some of its members. And then in October 2003, a video was released showing the pair doing target practice on March the 6th, 1999, so only about 6 weeks before the massacre. In nearby foothills known as Rampart Range, with the weapons they would use in the massacre. They also kept 5 videotapes shot with school video equipment that documented their weapons, as well as their plans and reasons for the massacre, including the ways they hid their arsenals and deceived their parents. They are known as the basement tapes. Apparently 30 minutes before the attack, they made a final video saying goodbye and apologizing to their friends and families. And in one of them, they spoke very angrily to the video camera, threatening to kill those people who would bully their friends. In another tape, they mocked Rachel Scott for her deeply held Christian beliefs. Rachel Scott had also criticized their violent videos and had therefore also earned their anger. It was, however, strange that, was it something like 1 year before the massacre, that Rachel Scott had performed a mime dance called Watch the Lamb, and in the middle of the performance, the music had stopped, leaving her stranded, but then Klebold had been able to help her by inserting another tape into the sound system. So, a Jeffco, or Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy, Neil Gardner, was assigned to the high school as a full-time uniformed and armed school resource officer. He usually ate lunch with students in the cafeteria, but on that very day, April the 20th, 1999, he was eating lunch in his patrol car at the northwest corner of the campus, watching students in the Smoker's Pit in Clement Park, a meadow adjacent to the school. 2 backpacks filled with pipe bombs, aerosol canisters, and small propane bombs were also placed in a field about 4.8 kilometers or 3 miles south of Columbine High School and 3.2 kilometers or 2 miles south of the fire station. Said to explode at approximately 11:14 a.m., the bombs were intended as a diversion to draw firefighters and emergency personnel away from the school. Only one of the pipe bombs and one of the aerosol canisters detonated, causing a small fire, which was quickly extinguished by the fire department. At 11:10 a.m., Harris and Klebold arrived separately at Columbine High School. And at 11:19 a.m., they shot 17-year-old Rachel Scott to the head, torso, and leg. With Rachel was her friend Richard Castaldo. They were both eating lunch. He was shot in the arm, chest, back, and abdomen, but survived. Castaldo at first did not take the pipe bomb seriously because to him it was probably no more than a crude senior prank. After all, Dylan and Eric were about to graduate, or should have graduated from Columbine High School later that spring. Then Daniel Rohrbo, aged 15, was fatally injured by shots to the abdomen and leg on the west staircase. Sean Graves, aged 15, was shot in the back, foot, and abdomen, but survived. So did Lance Kirkland, who was critically injured by shots to the leg, neck, and jaw. On the west staircase, Michael Johnson was also shot. He was then aged 15 in the face, arm, and leg to the west of the staircase, but survived. Mark Taylor, aged 16, was shot in the chest, arms, and leg, but survived. Anne-Marie Hochhalter, aged 17, was shot in the chest, arm, abdomen, back, and left leg near the cafeteria's entrance. She survived, but unfortunately lost her ability to walk and has been confined to a wheelchair since the shooting. 17-year-old Brian Anderson was injured near the west entrance by flying glass, but survived. A part-time visual arts teacher, Patty Nielsen, aged 35, was in the library and then kept that phone line open throughout the shooting there. She had called 911 shortly before the two perpetrators entered the library, and then she yelled at the students to keep their heads under the tables. She was aged 35 and was hit in the shoulder by shrapnel near the west entrance, but survived. 17-year-old Stephanie Munson was shot in the ankle inside the north hallway, but survived. Then David Sanders, aged 47, was the only teacher to die in the massacre. He died of blood loss after being shot in the neck and back inside the south hallway. Much has been made in the 2 decades since the Columbine high school student about high school massacre, about the local police officers' slow response, and some conspiracy theorists have even claimed that some level of government was involved, whether city, state, or federal government, in the slowness of this response. Anyway, what is certain is that if the police officers had access to Harris's website, if that affidavit that had been prepared by a police officer in February 1998 had been filed, then it's possible that the entire massacre would have been prevented, and Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold could well have been arrested and placed in a youth correctional facility. At 11:22 a.m., the custodian called Deputy Neil Gardner, the assigned resource officer to Columbine, on the school radio, requesting assistance in the senior parking lot. The only paved route took him around the school to the east and south on Pierce Street, where at 11:23 a.m. he heard on his police radio that a female was down and assumed she had been struck by a car. While exiting his patrol car in the senior lot at 11:24 a.m., he heard another call on the school radio, "Neil, there's a shooter in the school." Deputy Paul Smoker, a motorcycle patrolman for the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, was writing a traffic ticket north of the school when the female down call came in at 11:23 a.m., most likely referring to the already dead Rachel Scott. He drove his motorcycle over grass between the athletic fields and headed toward the west entrance. The two deputies had begun to rescue 2 wounded students near the ball fields when another gunfight broke out at 11:26 a.m. as Harris returned to the double doors and again began shooting at Deputy Gardner, who returned fire. From the hilltop, Deputy Smoker fired 3 rounds from his pistol at Harris, who again retreated into the building. As before, no one was hit. And then teacher David Sanders and 2 custodians, John Curtis and Jay Galatine, initially told students to get under the tables, then successfully evacuated students up the staircase leading to the second floor of the school. The stairs were located around the corner from the library hallway in the main south hallway. Sanders then tried to secure as much of the school as he could. The library massacre took place during 7 minutes, 11:29 to 11:36 a.m. Patty Nielsen started her dramatic call to 911 at 11:25 a.m. At the time, there were 52 students, 2 teachers, and 2 librarians in the library. Evan Todd, aged 15, survived minor injuries from the splintering of a desk under which he was hiding. 16-year-old Kyle Velasquez was killed by gunshot wounds to the head and back. 17-year-old Patrick Ireland survived injuries in the head and foot. So did 17-year-old Daniel Stapleton, but he was shot in the thigh. 18-year-old Mackay Hall was shot in the knee. 14-year-old Stephen Kernow was killed by a shot to the neck. 17-year-old Casey Rügzeger, probably a German name, was shot in the shoulder, hand, and neck, but survived. 17-year-old Cassie Burnell was killed by a shotgun wound to the head. The gunshot wound indicated, according to her mother, that the gun's muzzle was touching her head. 18-year-old Isaiah Scholes was killed by a shot to the chest. So was 16-year-old Matthew Kester. 18-year-old Lisa Kreutz was shot in the shoulder, hand, arms, and thigh, but survived. 18-year-old Valine Schnur was injured with wounds to the chest, arms, and abdomen, but survived. 17-year-old Mark Kintgen was shot in the head and shoulder, but survived. 18-year-old Lauren Townsend was killed by multiple gunshot wounds to the head, chest, and lower body. 16-year-old Nicole Nolan was shot in the abdomen, but survived. 16-year-old John Tomlin was killed by multiple shots to the head and neck. 16-year-old Kelly Fleming was killed by a shotgun wound to the back. 18-year-old Gianna Park was shot in the knee, shoulder, and foot, but survived. 15-year-old Daniel Mauser was killed by a single shot to the face. 17-year-old Jennifer Doyle was shot in the hand, leg, and shoulder, but survived. 17-year-old Austin Eubanks was shot in the hand and knee, but survived. Finally, 17-year-old Corey DePuter was killed by shots to the chest and neck. At 12:08 p.m., the two boys committed suicide. By noon, SWAT teams were stationed outside the school, too late to help a majority or many of the victims. By that time, almost everyone who was to die that day had already died. The one person who hadn't died, David Sanders, was slowly bleeding to death in a classroom. Ambulances started taking the wounded to local hospitals. A call for additional ammunition for police officers in case of a shootout came at 12:20 p.m. Authorities reported pipe bombs by 1 p.m. and two SWAT teams entered the school at 1:09 p.m., so 1 hour after the perpetrators had shot themselves dead, moving from classroom to classroom, discovering hidden students and faculty. Meanwhile, families of students and staff were asked to gather at nearby Leawood Elementary School to await information. Seriously injured Patrick Ireland, who was paralyzed on his right side, crawled to the library windows where on live television at 2:38 p.m. he stretched out the window, intending to fall into the arms of two SWAT team members standing on the roof of an emergency vehicle, but instead falling directly onto the vehicle's roof in a pool of blood. He became known as the boy in the window. So that concludes my video. Now, I wish that none of those incidents took place anymore, but I'm afraid that as long as this age of the world lasts, as long as the evil powers have a limited freedom of action, those incidents will take place, but at least let's pray that they would be minimized as much as possible.